One of my favorite things to do as a student of philosophy is to take complex, overwhelming ideas and break them down into simpler, more easily digestible ones while still maintaining the core truths. And lately I've been fascinated with telling one of the most important stories in human history, the Proto-Indo-European Migration. Today I'm going to be focusing solely on the branch of Proto-Indo-Europeans that became the Celtic and the Germanic peoples respectively, although in the future I do hope to cover all of the Proto-Indo-European migrations into Southern and Central Europe, into Russia and Asia, and even down into India and the Middle East. There are hundreds of videos on the Proto-Indo-Europeans and their various migrations, so in this video my aim is to provide a simple yet thorough analysis of how the Proto-Indo-Europeans became the Celtic and Germanic tribes that we all know today. Now, to be perfectly clear, there are hundreds of videos on the Proto-Indo-European migrations. I wanted to make a video that was simple and easy to follow so that people from various interests and intellectual backgrounds can understand and have an entry point into this vastly complex topic. So if you are a serious history buff and you think that I'm skipping over some details, I am. I'm doing it for the sake of simplicity. So with that being said, let's dive in and begin with the root of everything, the Proto-Indo-Europeans. Around 4500 BC, a group known as the Proto-Indo-Europeans lived on the Pontic-Caspian steppe north of the Black Sea. They were a pastoral and nomadic people who herded cattle, sheep, and horses. The domestication of the horse was huge for them as it allowed for their pastoral and nomadic lifestyle to flourish, as well as the ease and swiftness of their migrations. Their society was patriarchal, which was antithetical to many of the matriarchal agrarian societies that were found in some of the other areas that they would migrate into. And their societies were mostly centered around warrior aristocracies that would be a lasting cultural imprint that you would see throughout the Proto-Indo-European migrations for thousands of years to come. From their homeland north of the Black Sea, they spread out across Europe into Asia and India, carrying their genetics, their language, and some of their customs. Which means that today, if you speak any Germanic language, Latin language, Greek-derived language, or Sanskrit-derived language, you speak a Proto-Indo-European language. But the Proto-Indo-Europeans didn't remain a singular people forever. Around 3300 BC, their culture would crystallize into what archaeologists refer to as the Yamnaya Horizon. So now we have the Yamnaya, a people who are different from the Proto-Indo-Europeans, right? Not exactly. Culturally, linguistically, and genetically, these are the exact same peoples. The reason that they are given a new name is because they moved. That's it. That's all it takes to become a new culture. All you have to do is leave your home territory, go somewhere else. Archaeologists and historians just give you a new name. And this is a pattern that we will see repeated over and over again throughout all of these various migrations, which is what makes this so interesting. Many of these people, genetically, linguistically, they're the exact same people. They just picked up and moved somewhere else and were given a new name. Genetically, the Yamnaya were, like their Proto-Indo-European ancestors, a blend of Eastern hunter-gatherers from Russia and Caucasus hunter-gatherers from the Caucasus Mountain regions. But their culture had hardened into something that was more recognizable than what the Proto-Indo-Europeans were at the time. When they first entered Europe, the Yamnaya men were able to overwhelm and outcompete all of the local Neolithic farmers that they encountered. This was largely due to their diet, which was heavy on meat and dairy products, as opposed to the Neolithic farmers whose diet was mostly centered around cereals and grains and stuff like that. Because of this, the Yamnaya men were able to outcompete the locals and intermarry with the Neolithic farmer women. As these migrations continued throughout Europe, this is where we start to see the crystallization of these new distinct archaeological cultures. We have the corded Ware in the north and central regions and the Beaker people in the west. So after the Yamnaya spread into Europe, one of the first big cultures that we see is the corded Ware culture in Central and Northern Europe. Around 2900 BC, these people start to crop up in areas all throughout Central and Northern Europe, places like Denmark, Germany, Poland, and even up north into Scandinavia. The reason for their name corded ware is because of their pottery remains, which looks like it has like rope imprints or cords pressed into them. Genetically, the corded ware were basically Yamnaya steppe herders mixed with Central European farmers, which were ultimately descended from the earlier Neolithic farmers that had migrated out of Anatolia. So if you were to break down their DNA, it would be roughly 3/4 Yamnaya steppe herder, 1/4 Neolithic farmer. The corded ware people were the carriers of the R1a haplogroup, the same haplogroup that would later explode among the Baltic, Slavic, and Germanic peoples. At the same time, another group starts bubbling up in Western Europe. This would be the Beaker people. They get their name also from their pottery, which looked like bell beakers. What's interesting about the Beaker culture is that the earliest Beakers actually appear all the way in Western Europe in Iberia, what is modern-day Spain and Portugal. This would be around 2800 BC, around the same time that the corded ware people show up. But the thing is, the original Beakers were not steppe-derived whatsoever. They were actually derived of Neolithic farmers. The real Beaker culture that would later turn into the many Celtic tribes that we know today actually didn't arrive until the Beakers from the Iberian Peninsula migrated into Central Europe, interacted with corded ware people, and you guessed it, same thing happened. The corded ware people that were mainly steppe-derived overwhelmed the local populations, and now you have a population of Beakers that are 50% steppe-derived and 50% Neolithic farmer. By the time the Beakers reached Britain and France and Western Europe again, about 500 years later, they were now the steppe-derived Beaker people that we're probably more familiar with. The Beakers would be the carrier of the R1b haplogroup, which is the most predominant haplogroup seen throughout all of Western Europe today. The Beaker people would be the backbone of what would later become the Celtic, Italic, and Latin tribes. So if we were to break it down very simply, we have the corded ware people in the northern areas that were 75% steppe, 25% Neolithic farmer, and then you have the Beaker people in the more southern, central, and western regions that would be 50% steppe-derived, 50% Neolithic farmer. What I find so fascinating about this so far is just the fact that all of these terms and all of these names that we are giving people are really just, one, archaeologically based, and two, they're based on migrations. The people who never left the Pontic-Caspian steppe area are still referred to as Yamnaya, technically. It would be these corded ware people who came and intermixed with these people called the globular amphora, but again, we're getting too archaeological, that became corded ware. These other people became Beaker just because they moved. So that's the pattern. You move, you mix, you get a new name. You move, you mix, you get a new name. So here we have an easily identifiable split. We have the corded ware people in the north that would later become the Proto-Germanics, and the Beaker people more in the south and western regions that would become the Proto-Celtic peoples. So here's where we make an important shift. We are now moving from archaeological terms like corded ware and Beaker into linguistic and genetic terms like Proto-Celtic and Proto-Germanic. So with that being said, let's move into the Celtic migrations. So what makes the Celts different from the Proto-Celts? You guessed it, they moved and then they spoke a little bit differently. The story of the Celts really begins with the Hallstatt culture, which flourished around 800 BC in Central Europe, particularly in the region of modern-day Austria. These Hallstatt elites, as we refer to them as, were the first people who would identify as distinctly Celtic, both in their material culture and their early linguistic development. From the Hallstatt culture, we have the Latin culture. I think I'm saying that correctly. Around 450 BC. They were centered around the region of what is modern-day Switzerland. The Latin people are often seen as the archetypal Celts with their distinct artistic styles, their ornate weaponry and shields, and their cultural influence that spread across much of Europe. Finally, by 400 BC, the Latin expansion gave rise to a number of major continental Celtic groups. First, we have the Gauls, who migrated out of Latin territory and became the dominant Celtic population of what is now France. By the 4th century BC, they had spread into northern Italy, famously clashing with Rome and even sacking the city in 390 BC. Next, we have the Gaels, who branched off around 300 BC and would go on to dominate Ireland and parts of Scotland. Next, we have the Celtiberians, who emerged around 300 BC when migrating Celtic groups intermingled with the native Iberian populations of Spain and Portugal. What's interesting about the Celtiberians is that when people think of Spain and Portugal, they don't really think of these people as being Celtically derived. And that's for a good reason, which we'll get into later, but also it is worth noting that Spain and Portugal is just as Celtic as, say, Ireland or France or Scotland. Meanwhile, around the same time, we also have the Belgae, who emerged around 300 BC in the lowlands of northern France, Belgium, and southern Britain. And as you can imagine, given their proximity to the Germanic territories, they did have heavy Germanic influence. Another offshoot, the Galatians, took shape around 280 BC. These were Celtic warriors who migrated eastward, eventually settling in central Turkey. They became a famous example of how far-reaching Celtic migrations could be, and they were immortalized in the Holy Bible as they were one of the first churches that Paul was writing letters to in the first century. Also, by 200 BC, we see the rise of the Brittonic Celts who came to dominate much of Britain. Among them were the Britons, forming the bulk of the island's Celtic-speaking population, and from the Britons came further regional groups, the Welsh in what is modern-day Wales, the Cornish, and the Bretons, who migrated into Brittany in France by around 500 AD. Finally, the Picts emerged in Scotland around 300 AD, and while their exact origins remain debated, they are generally considered an offshoot of the Brittonic Celts as well. The Celtic migrations occurred much earlier and much faster than the Germanic migrations, as we will see very shortly, and this quick migration would actually have a huge impact on how the rest of European history pans out. So, what did the Germanic world look like during this same time frame? The story of the Germanic peoples begins in the Nordic Bronze Age and the Jastorf culture, which thrived from about 1700 BC to 500 BC in Scandinavia and northern Germany. Out of this northern heartland, the Proto-Germanic language and culture began to take shape, blending Indo-European roots with unique local traditions. And by around 500 BC, we can finally begin speaking of early Proto-Germanic tribes. By the time we reach the Roman era, around 300 BC to 100 AD, we finally start to see tribal names for the Germanic peoples, mostly given to us by Roman authors. Around 120 BC, the Cimbri and the Teutones left Denmark and stormed southward into Roman lands, becoming some of the first Germanic peoples to clash with the empire. Soon after, the Suebi emerged around 100 BC in what is now Germany and ultimately made their way all the way into Iberia in what is now northern Portugal, where they would establish a kingdom that resisted Roman rule for hundreds of years. Now, before they migrated into Portugal, we also have another branch of the Suebi that would be known as the Alemanni, who by 200 AD had settled in parts of Germany, France, and Switzerland, which is where we ultimately get the Latin name for Germany. Alemania or Alemagni or Alemanni, you get the idea. Up next, we have the Cherusci, known from around 50 BC in northern Germany, and they would achieve lasting fame under their leader Arminius, who annihilated 3 Roman legions in the Teutoburg forest in 9 AD in one of the greatest military failures that Rome had ever suffered. Around the same time, the Chatti also rose to prominence in central Germany, and from the Chatti came the Batavi, who by 50 BC had settled in the Netherlands. Around 100 AD, the Lombards emerged in northern Germany before migrating southward into Italy, where they would establish a lasting Lombardian kingdom. Then we have the Franks, who began forming around 250 AD in the region of Germany, the Netherlands, and Belgium. Over time, they would migrate into France, where they overpowered the local Celtic Gauls and laid the foundations for the medieval Frankish kingdoms to come. Other tribes from this same time period included the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, all appearing around 100 AD in Denmark and northern Germany. Obviously, centuries later, these 3 tribes would famously cross the sea into Britain, giving rise to the Anglo-Saxon identity as they overpowered the local Brittonic Celts. And the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes that never left Denmark? They became the Danes. Around 200 AD, the Heruli appear in Sweden, which would be our first distinguishable Germanic Scandinavian tribe, and among them we also have the Goths, who originated in Sweden around 100 AD and migrated south into Poland and then into Ukraine, where they became a major force pressing against Rome's borders. In the 3rd and 4th centuries, they raided Roman territory repeatedly, even sacking great cities in the Balkans and Greece. Rome did their best to fight them off, but after the disastrous Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD, where the Goths destroyed an entire Roman army and killed the Roman emperor, the empire was forced to settle them inside its borders as foederati, or foederity. I've heard people call it, but I'm pretty sure it's foederati. I could be wrong. Foederati were essentially allies with Rome that were settled inside of its borders. They were given land in exchange for military service. Okay, so from here, the Gothic people gradually split into two groups. You have the Visigoths, or Western Goths, who turned west, obviously, and then, of course, sacked Rome again in 410 AD. But they later established kingdoms in France and Spain. And the Ostrogoths, or Eastern Goths, moved south into Italy, where Theodoric the Great carved out a Gothic kingdom in the ruins of the Western Roman Empire after its fall. Alongside them were the Vandals, who began around 100 AD in Poland and Germany before embarking on the longest known Germanic migration through Spain, finally into North Africa, where they established a powerful kingdom that eventually also sacked Rome in 455 AD. So if we were to zoom out and look at a map, we can see that these Germanic tribes spread all over Europe into Celtic territories, into Roman territories, into Scandinavian territories, and even into North African territories. So how was it that the Germanic peoples, who were once indistinguishable from their Celtic cousins, came to dominate all of Europe? Well, there are a few reasons for this. For one, the Celts never really built large, stable federations. They always relied heavily on these small tribal chiefdoms and warrior aristocracies, and this worked well for a period. But the problem is that the Celts were essentially growing at the same time as Rome. So even when they achieved great victories, like the Gauls' sack of Rome in 390 BC, they really failed to capitalize on those victories and consolidate power. Internal rivalries between warring Celtic tribes meant that they were never unified and they were easily defeatable by larger forces. The Germanics, on the other hand, although they were also tribal in nature, proved far more capable of forming large coalitions. You have confederations like those of the Suebi and the Alemanni and the Goths, and this strength in numbers gave them the ability to stand up to larger forces like a Roman military. So a Celtic tribe to them was nothing. Like I mentioned, timing also has a lot to do with it. The Celts migrated much earlier and they established themselves much quicker, and they were establishing themselves at the same time that Rome was coming into prominence. It's really sad, honestly. The Celts reached their height at the same time that Rome was becoming an empire. Rome systematically absorbed all of these Celtic nations, starting in Spain and Portugal, moving up through France into Britain, and pretty soon all of the Celtic territories became Roman territories. The Germanic peoples, on the other hand, were not really on the move at the same time as the Celts. They remained in the northern forest and bogs of north-central Europe, and they didn't press into Rome until Rome was already starting to weaken by the first few centuries AD. Rome was already overstretched. They were facing internal turmoil with emperors warring with each other, and they were also facing external pressures from roughly the entire surrounding world. So when the Goths and the Vandals and the Franks started pressing on Rome's borders, they were facing an empire that was already partially fragmented. It was relatively easy for them to come in and establish themselves. With that being said, there's more to it than just coming in at the right time. There's also their willingness to adopt Roman customs and culture. Though they were politically fragmented, the Celts were incredibly resilient at holding on to their culture. So even when they faced Romanization and Rome was coming into their territories, the Celts held on to their culture for dear life. The Germans? Not so much. While they seized political control from Rome, they were also more than willing to adopt Roman customs and culture like Latin law, Christianity, the Roman idea of kingship, and the main Roman custom that the Germanic peoples adopted was this desire to drive into Celtic territories and establish kingdoms. Rome already did it once, they knew they could do it again. So in this sense, the Celts lost politically, but they survived culturally, and you can still see this today in places like Ireland, Wales, Scotland, and Brittany, where Celtic peoples still very much exist and Celtic culture thrives. While the Germanics won politically and militarily, establishing kingdoms and dominance over Europe, they really don't have any unique, distinct culture like the Celts do because they are heavily Romanized. But this would serve them well coming into the Middle Ages and establishing kingdoms that would eventually pan out and shape the rest of Europe. So although the Celts still did exist in, the fringes of Western Europe, it would really be the Germanic tribes who built nearly every major kingdom that we would see throughout the Middle Ages. In Gaul, the Franks rose under Clovis, who united the tribes and accepted Christianity around 500 AD. This marriage of Germanic kingship with the Roman religion created the foundation of France, while Charlemagne's later empire gave shape to medieval Europe itself. Down south in Italy, we have the Lombards, who came in after Rome had fallen, and they created an empire themselves. Though eventually they were conquered by Charlemagne, their rule in Italy cemented a Germanic presence in the peninsula. In the areas of Spain and Portugal, the Visigoths, who were once Roman allies, founded a kingdom in Iberia after Rome's collapse. They ruled until the Muslim conquest in 711, yet their legacy endured in the idea of a Christian Gothic lineage that Spanish nobles would claim for centuries after they had reconquered Spain and Portugal from the Muslims, which we will definitely get into in a future video. The Vandals also conquered Iberia for a period of time, but they would ultimately establish themselves in North Africa. In the area of Britain, the Angles and Saxons and Jutes, who migrated from Denmark and northern Germany into Britain, drove out or assimilated the Britons, creating the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. These would eventually unify into what we know today as England, with a Germanic language, of course, English. In the north, we have the Norse tribes, the Swedes, the Norwegians, and the Danes, who were basically Anglo-Saxons who never got on the boat, who began exploring outward as Vikings, raiding and settling from Russia to Ireland and even potentially down into the Middle East. But they also consolidated at home, forming the medieval kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, all built on Germanic foundations. And finally, in Central Europe, in the territory where it all began, the patchwork of tribes that once fought Rome coalesced into the Holy Roman Empire. These were Germanic people who had adopted Roman customs completely and formed their own empire. From this came the foundations of what would eventually become Germany and Austria. By 1200 AD, the pattern was pretty clear. The major kingdoms of medieval Europe, France, England, Germany, Spain, Italy, Scandinavia, were all born of Germanic tribes. The Celts were the first to dominate and migrate throughout much of Europe, but they had become reduced to the margins. History often looks like a battlefield of differences. Tribes clashing, empires rising and falling, kingdoms forming. But when you pull back far enough, you can see that all of these people came from the same place. The Celts, the Germans, the Romans, the Slavs, all these people were branches of the same ancient root, the Proto-Indo-Europeans. So yes, through migrations and various wars and the rising and falling of kingdoms, Europe became what it is today. Some branches of this tree withered, some of them grew stronger, but none of them stood apart from the root that held them all together. And in the end, as we can see, the nations of today are not necessarily separate stories. They are all interconnected, and they're echoes of one singular people. And this, in my opinion, is the beauty of the story of the Proto-Indo-European migrations. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and drop a comment and subscribe. And if you want to see more videos like this, I would love to make more. I hope that this was simple and easy to follow enough. We'll definitely have to go more in depth, maybe into the cultural and religious and mythological aspects of these people. So yeah, let me know in the comments what you guys would like to see, and I will see you guys next time.